OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about non-rational responsibility as ontological necessity. Where reality is fundamentally paradoxical and incomplete, we require non-rational action to keep reality from collapsing under its own being or from causing Nash equilibria. This was inspired by Brandon over at Brandon's Bookshelf. He has a great channel and does wonderful reflections, wonderful work. I love his series on the philosophical book tag. And I love the video he did with Pei. He always makes my day to see Pei over from Attention. And Brandon was recently discussing where he saw Jordan Peterson live, Dr. Peterson, and I've had a few pieces on Peterson, say with Davood, Mr. Gosley, and different things. And, something that Dr. Peterson will really often talk about is responsibility. And Brandon in this video was talking about some of the thoughts that Mr. Peterson had and how much he appreciated that. It seemed like a real, genuine session where Dr. Peterson was really thinking through his thoughts, thinking live, trying to kind of wrestle with what it means to be responsible and what is responsibility. And I think we hear about responsibility a lot, and we know there's a sense that it's very important. But at the same time, there can be a feeling that responsibility is used to oppress, that it's used, say, in capitalism to make people go to their job and be a good worker, a good gear in a machine. Also, we can associate responsibility with control. We say, the X person is responsible and therefore they control what they're responsible for. And so responsibility can be seen as contributing to the patriarchy, where men say, I'm responsible for the family and therefore they control the family. And Dr. Peterson is often accused of contributing to the patriarchy, which he resists and that he combats against, instead stating that he's trying to really describe what is fitting, what is balanced, what is going to create a harmony between the sexes, but that's an entirely different subject. But what is responsibility exactly? What is it? And also I'll note in the same, I've never met anyone who thinks they're not responsible. So what's going on? And then, of course, if nobody thinks they're irresponsible, then when you hear someone like Dr. Peterson saying people need to be responsible, it can be heard as saying that liberals or woke people are not responsible, because often Dr. Peterson is seen as opposing liberal thought or wokeism. Again, that's an accusation he resists. He claims that he is not some hard conservative. But the point is that you hear Dr. Peterson talking about responsibility, and that can be associated with an indirect way of saying that liberals are not responsible, or that they're anti-responsible. So what is this responsibility exactly? Well, most of us would say that responsibility is if you do X and Y occurs, then it's your responsibility to deal with Y. It's associated with basic cause and effect. It's associated with monitoring and making sure that things are optimal, that things work out. But I think this sense of responsibility, although true, might be missing the deep existential, psychological, and philosophical meaning of responsibility. And to help understand what I mean by that, if I'm standing with a group of friends and I'm holding a ball and I throw it straight up in the air and it comes down and it hits someone on the head, we'd all say, well, Dan, you're responsible for hitting that person on the head. What the heck, man? There's a sense I could have looked around. I could have seen what was good. I could have seen people nearby. I could have known what would occur if I throw a ball straight into the air. It's going to fall and maybe land on somebody's head. So I am responsible for that. And there'd be little debate that I should be responsible for that, because, there's no good reason for why I couldn't look around and tell that someone would get hurt if I threw a ball straight up into the air. And in a sense, that kind of responsibility, which is very immediate, is very present, and is kind of given to us by the situations we are in, we are constantly and always engaging in that kind of responsibility. I have a cup of coffee nearby. I have it on the table, and my laptop's right here. If I were to spill the the coffee on the laptop or the recorder here, it would be my fault. Don't I know that coffee, should not be near a computer? It should not be near an MP3 recorder like this? Well, yes, I know it. That's why I have it set on the table over there. And I could look around this office. I don't have a cup of water near the electric socket over there. So every moment of every day, you're arguably surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands, of instances of opportunities to be responsible, of to take in your surrounding, to be smart about it and not do something, and not respond to it in a manner that would cause trouble. However, what about being responsible for things you don't know is going to happen, or that is not immediately given to you by your facticity. Say it's your job to manage the trucks at the warehouse. And you've coordinated it all, and one of the truck drivers calls and says that their tire is broke down. And then you have to explain to the customer why they're not going to have their product on time because you're the wholesale and you transport to the smaller shops. You are seen as responsible for dealing with the customer who's going to be angry, who might expect special treatment because of this situation, and so on and so forth. But you didn't know that the truck was going to break down. There was no way you could plan for it. There's a way in which it seems really unfair for you to have to take responsibility for the truck the truck breaking down. I mean, couldn't the driver have checked his tires? Couldn't he have brought a different tires? Couldn't the driver figure out how to fix the situation? We can come up with a million explanations for why it's not our responsibility, and yet one of the whole reasons people are hired to do jobs, or that they're paid, is to take responsibility for these situations that they didn't know was going to happen ahead of time, and that in a very real sense seems unfair for people to take responsibility for. So there seems to be two very different kinds of responsibility that I think are conflated together. I want to call one low order causality, one low order responsibility, and the high order responsibility. And this is alluding to a paper called Experiencing Thinking that talks about low order causality and high order causality or complexity. And basically the idea is the following. Low order causality is when a billiard ball rolls across the table, hits another, and the other billiard ball moves. High order causality is when a billiard ball rolls across the table, hits the other one. And I remember that time I played pool with my sister, and so I think to call her. The second high order causality is causality just as much as the low order causality, the linear, the more traditional causality, and yet it's more invisible, it's more difficult to see, it's more dynamic, and it's much more bound up to me as a person, because for other people, seeing billiard balls hit one another would not mean call your sister, but for me it does, because it triggers a memory, and I remember, and I played pool with my sister when I was younger, for example. So low order responsibility is, say, taking responsibility for the billiard balls hitting one another. You knew that if you hit the billiard ball, it would roll into the next, so you're responsible for it. So there's this low order responsibility that's very given and also very much less debatable. Everyone is standing around, everyone can see the same facts. We can see, it's a contained system, it's a contained situation, and so low order responsibility is much easier to define, much easier to understand who should take responsibility for it, and so on and so forth. But high order responsibility is very interesting here, because once I think of my sister, and I think of the fact that I haven't called her, there's a sense in which now that I've had that thought, I am responsible to act on it, and I know I should because I haven't called my sister in a long time. And yet no one in the room is going to hold me responsible for this. No one's going to think I'm responsible for calling my sister. It's much more contained, much more closed to me. So I could easily just, forget the thought, let it go. No one's going to hold it to me. And yet there's a sense in which I'm doing something irresponsible by not calling my sister, because indeed in this situation the responsible thing to do would be to call her, and yet I can't be blamed for it. I'm much more alone for it. Now here's the interesting thought. Once I call my sister, and let's say that I say something stupid, or I hurt her feelings, offend her, or something like that. Well, I'm responsible then for hurting her feelings. I'm responsible for making her upset or responding in the wrong way. This is what's interesting. Once I have the thought that I need to call my sister, no one else knows I have that thought. And if I call her, then I could mess up, and I'll be responsible for that mistake I make. And that feels really kind of unfair, right? Because even the very act of calling her, there's a kind of nobility in it, because I, know that if I didn't, no one would blame me, and I don't have to do it, but I'm doing it by choice. But then I'm responsible for what occurs in that phone call, and I'll have to deal with it. And this is where we can start to see why responsibility is so difficult, and once we start talking about high order responsibility. And I think there's a sense in which maybe Dr. Peterson, whenever he talks about responsibility, is actually talking about high order responsibility in this sense. So there's something noble in calling the sister, and then if something goes wrong, or if she's upset, or she says something that puts a thought in my head that then I have to wrestle with for like 2 months or something, because he says maybe I was bad at math, or that I was a bad brother or something for not calling her sooner, that all feels very unfair. Shouldn't she just be grateful that I'm calling her at all, and she's getting mad at me now because I didn't call her enough? It doesn't seem fair. And yet, calling her in that situation can be the right thing to do. This starts to suggest, so let's ask this. If you have the thought that you need to call your sister, enter your head because of high order causality or stuff like that, or, the other example I gave with the trucks is something occurs that you didn't know was going to occur, which life is full of because there's no perfect knowledge. No one knows everything that's going to occur in life. So here's the question. If calling your sister could cause trouble, and, if you don't call her sister, no one can get mad at you for not calling her, and even your sister won't know, at least in that moment, that you didn't call her then. Is it rational to call your sister or not to call your sister? What's the rational thing to do? Well, it's arguably rational not to call her, right? No one's going to be mad at you, stuff could go wrong, and so rationally, you may never call your sister. And then we start to see where isolationism, the fall apart of social relations, families, and different things can start to occur. Because, a lot of times these relationships or these communities are actually held together by people taking responsibility for their actions. But why would you take, or responsibility for the relationships, but why would you take responsibility for them? Why not wait until they take responsibility for them? Why not wait for your sister to call you, right? So that you can make sure it's at a time when she's open to speaking with you, where she wants to speak with you, and so on and so forth. This all suggests that there might be some game theory involved with responsibility, which a Nash equilibrium, as I've discussed with Lorenzo before, a Nash equilibrium is a situation where if everyone does what's rational, you end up with a suboptimal result. And I think very often what ends up happening is responsibility is non-rational, and Lorenzo and I will talk about how the only way to escape Nash equilibrium is non-rational action, and we also talk about with David John and Benjamin Fontaine. Non-rational is not irrational. So one of the things I think has gotten us in trouble is we think in terms of rational, irrational, and really we need to add non-rational, which transcends the dichotomy and can help us escape. Because if we just think, here's the thing, if we go, oh, is it rational or irrational to call our sister, then we may never call her, because, if it's not rational, then it's irrational, and therefore you wouldn't do it. And so you get trapped into thinking about the world purely in rational or irrational terms, when really there could be situations that doing what's rational gives you a suboptimal result, and what you need to do is something that's non-rational, something that transcends the categories of simple rationality or irrationality, like a raw free choice. When you have that high order thought because of the billiard balls to call your sister, it's an act of total freedom. It's an act of, non one's going to hold you to it. No one knows what you're thinking. It's not rational necessarily to call her. Once you introduce non-rational though to your thinking, then it doesn't have to be irrational. It can be a kind of Kierkegaardian leap of faith. It can be a kind of choice. But that means it's very existential. It can be very anxiety producing, and very, very difficult. But if we know that acting rational all the time can give us suboptimal results, well, then we can start to understand why we need to be non-rational sometimes and call our sister. I think what's very interesting is that considering all this, responsibility can be irrational, almost always irrational in the high order sense. I mean, again, it can be irrational to take a responsibility at work for what the trucks are going to do when you don't know what's going to happen. And here's the thing, the majority of what life throws at us, we don't know life is going to throw at us because we don't have perfect knowledge. We don't know what life is going to bring. And yet, if no one takes responsibility for what life throws at us, we're in huge trouble. Nothing's going to get done. No one's going to address what life throws at us. No one's going to respond to what life throws at us, and things will get bad. You'll get a suboptimal result. So you have to have people take responsibility for what they don't know is going to happen, which seems so unfair and so unjust and so wrong and irrational. And therefore, there's always rational reason not to take responsibility. And yet, if everyone does what's rational, you get a suboptimal result. You get a Nash equilibrium, or what I also will call a rational impasse, a situation where rationality gets itself stuck or gets itself into trouble. It cannot advance. In this way, once we introduce, this is why introducing non-rationality to our thinking is so important, because then we can start thinking about, instead of taking responsibility and being held responsible for what we choose, say to call our sister and what happens after that, or to take the job where the truck breaks down, and it seems unfair, unjust, and so on, that, we have to take responsibility for stuff we don't know what's going to happen again. We can start introducing, though, categories like non-fair or non-just, because we have to change the way that we understand choice. And I think one of the reasons, and if we don't, then it's always just going to be irrational, unjust, and unfair to take responsibility or to be responsible for things, and therefore no one will do it, and you'll get a big Nash equilibrium. I think one of the reasons why, again, responsibility can be controversial or seem so wrong, is precisely because there's this kind of unfairness and irrationality to it, which I don't think there's any hope of us getting through if we don't understand the necessary role of non-rationality. And indeed, the other thing that's happened is because, what I'm describing here is a kind of existential rationality. What I'm describing here is a kind of existential responsibility. Often responsibility, when people use that language, is very corporate, it's very capitalistic, and it implies status and control and stuff like that. So then responsibility just seems like a code word for domination and using other people to get ahead. But I think what Dr. Peterson is trying to get at is this existential, non-rational, psychological responsibility that you could associate, perhaps with a Jesus who's taking on the sins of the world even though he's sinless, and yet someone like Jesus is necessary, perhaps to break the scapegoat mechanism that Gerard is talking about, to end sacred violence. Somebody has to do what Jesus is doing. An innocent man has to take on the sins of the world to end the suboptimal result of the scapegoat mechanism. If nobody takes that non-rational responsibility, then the world will fall apart. And again, the paper is going to really talk about how responsibility, as we're describing it here, is necessary given the lack of perfect knowledge in the world, the fact that we don't know what's going to happen next. And yet if we only take responsibility for what we know is going to happen, or what we know the outcome is going to be, and so on and so forth, well, then we're only going to have responsibility in terms of low-order complexity, low-order responsibility, and all the high-order responsibility will not be addressed and not taken care of. And high-order causality will get the best of us. High-order complexity, which would include the unexpected, the black swan, the emergent, so on and so forth, we won't prepare for and we won't think accordingly, and that will prove very problematic and lead us to suboptimal results. So we have to have this non-rational responsibility, and the paper at the end will also allude to the fact we need non-rationality in general is because humans are ontologically paradoxical, which is to say we are AB as opposed to AA. We're more of an A equals B creature than an AA creature, which is to say that we're ontologically divided by time. Our ideas of how the world works is not how the world actually is. We don't have perfect knowledge, and so on and so forth. All of this, because of our ontology, we need non-rationality and non-rational responsibility, because otherwise, if we operate just according to AA, we end up in effacement. Because we're actually AB ontologically. Now, all of that is an entirely different subject. It's taken up in the Truism of the Rational, mainly reconstructing A as A, but the paper is also going to point to the reason non-rationality plays such a role is because of our ontological AB nature. For more from Brandon, please visit brandonsbookshelf.com. OG Rose, you can find at YouTube, the website, Anchor, Instagram, and thank you so much for your time.